In the depths of antiquity, before humanity knew the benefits of modern civilization, it is difficult to imagine a daily existence filled with comfort. Members of ancient societies lacked fundamental conveniences such as centralized water supply, electricity, accessible medicine, as well as means of transportation and communication like cars, airplanes, the internet, or telephones. These and many other attributes that we, people of the 21st century, consider indispensable for a decent life, were completely unknown to them. However, amidst these deprivations and seemingly pervasive harshness, a unique civilization flourished in the heart of the Peloponnese, ancient Sparta. Here, a special class existed, known to us as citizens. These chosen individuals possessed the full extent of political power and all available resources, yet they were strictly forbidden from engaging in manual labor or commercial activities. In other words, they had absolutely everything one could dream of in that era, and the burden of daily work did not fall upon them. Sounds like an impossible dream, doesn't it? But before we delve into this seeming idyll, it's worth looking beyond the veil of privileges and understanding that even for these chosen few, life in Sparta, contrary to all expectations, was permeated by incredible harshness, the details of which are capable of astonishing the imagination. And speaking of Sparta, we already encounter the first historical inaccuracy that conceals far deeper mysteries. The very name of this state, known to us today as Sparta, is not historically correct and became common only thanks to the Romans. To confirm this, one only needs to look at the legendary shield of a Spartan hoplite. The letter, lambda, is clearly visible on it. This is no coincidence, for the true self-designation of these mighty warriors and their state was entirely different. They called themselves Lacedaemonians, after their city of Lacedaemon, whose name, incidentally, even experienced researchers often mispronounce with the accent on the last syllable. The modern name, Sparta, became established significantly later, solely due to the Romans, who renamed the city, from which the name we are so accustomed to today originated. Another widespread misconception concerns the notion of Sparta as a completely isolated and closed state. In reality, such a statement is inaccurate, as this polis flourished for almost a millennium, spanning approximately from the 10th to the 1st century BC. It should be remembered that ancient Greece never constituted a single, centralized state. On the contrary, it was characterized by significant political fragmentation, consisting of countless polis, each possessing unique cultural features, distinctive customs, and its own legal systems. Sparta was located in the southern part of the Peloponnese Peninsula, in an area known as Laconia. It is from the name of this region that the term, laconic speech, originates, denoting a brief, yet extremely concise and meaningful statement. Such a name is no accident, as the inhabitants of Sparta were by no means prone to verbosity, or idle chatter. At the apex of Sparta's social hierarchy were individuals whose lineage traced back to the earliest inhabitants of this land, meaning those who laid the foundations of the city around 800 BC. These representatives of the highest class were called Spartiates, and their number included both men and women. Nevertheless, only men from this group held the status of full citizens, capable of participating in the political life of the polis. Notably, Spartan women were granted significantly more rights and freedoms compared to their contemporaries in other polis of ancient Greece. They were not only allowed to own land but also to receive an education. However, it should be emphasized that all known historical figures who stood at the origin of the city-states were male. The status of a Spartiate was not automatically granted. Acquiring privileges in the polis required convincingly proving one's suitability and usefulness. This meant that every citizen had to be strong, athletic, possess cunning, and unwavering discipline. The initial assessment of conformity to these strict criteria occurred at the very dawn of an individual's life. Specially appointed priests and high-ranking officials meticulously inspected newborns, and if an infant was found to have obvious physical defects or clear signs of non-viability, it was taken to the foot of Mount Taygetus, condemning it to certain death. However, it is important to realize that this practice is largely part of the mythology actively popularized in the works of Plutarch, the renowned ancient Greek writer, historian, and philosopher. Nevertheless, before condemning the actions of the Spartans, It should be noted that similar customs existed in many other cultures, both among Hellenic polis and beyond. The reasons for such a harsh practice are quite understandable. In antiquity, caring for children with special needs was practically impossible, and society did not provide a place for those who could not ensure their own survival. Nevertheless, from the perspective of modern humanism, accepting such a practice as the norm seems extremely difficult. It should be particularly emphasized that this measure was applied exclusively to extremely frail infants. The mere presence of illness was not a reason for expulsion from Sparta, allowing such individuals to continue their existence. Although their social status might have been low, there were even special military formations whose task was not direct participation in battles, but rather providing aid and support to active fighters on the battlefield. In other words, their functions were reduced to auxiliary tasks, a kind of fetch and carry. A widespread myth claims that weak children were thrown off a mountain cliff, accompanied by shouts of, "From Sparta!" However, this is no more than a legend deeply rooted in popular consciousness. Archaeological investigations conducted at the foot of this mountain have found only the remains of adults. Such punishment was applied to adult citizens in cases of grave crimes, such as treason or other serious violations of the polis's laws. Spartiates who passed the strict natural selection from the age of 7 were sent to a unique educational institution known as the agoge. Naturally, the financial burden for this education fell on the boy's family. In the absence of such financial capability, the boy's fate was predetermined, practically hopeless. For a Spartiate who failed to achieve the status of a full citizen, there were only two paths: either face public ostracism and be exiled from the polis, or spend the rest of his life bearing the stigma of shame and public contempt. Undoubtedly, the central task of the educational process in the agoge was to transform a young, still unformed boy into a valiant and unwavering warrior. The reason lies in the inseparable connection between the concepts of citizen of Sparta and soldier, which were virtually synonymous. Protecting Sparta from external threats was not merely a function but the primary duty of every Spartan citizen, which, in turn, dictated the need for extremely intensive training and deep, comprehensive preparation. The effectiveness of the agoge as an educational institution was largely explained by strict adherence to numerous, often harsh, rules. The main one stipulated that the student had to belong to the class of Spartiates. However, there were rare exceptions when foreign boys were admitted to the agoge for training. Such youths were called stratum, but their numbers remained extremely small. A mandatory condition for them was to be from aristocratic families of other Greek polis. Another exception was the syntrophoi, sons of slaves who were adopted by Spartan families. A notable feature was that these boys were given the unique opportunity to gain full Spartan citizenship after successfully completing the entire course of study in the agoge. Students of the ancient agoge were often strictly forbidden from maintaining contact with their families. They were expected that such isolation would allow them to harden their spirit, acquire outstanding moral resilience, learn to provide for themselves through agriculture or, if necessary, obtain food through cunning and survive in the harshest conditions. These qualities were considered paramount for the formation of a true Spartan. In addition to individual endurance, great importance was placed on strengthening mutual trust among the trainees. This contributed to the creation of a more cohesive and effective fighting formation, ready for future military actions. There were many cases when young Spartans were intentionally left in the wilderness, for example, in a forest, forcing them to independently find a way out of the most difficult situations. In the modern world, such methods might be considered hazing or bullying, but in antiquity, it was perceived as an integral part of the normal training process. Young Spartans underwent training in the agoge until they reached the age of 20. If the trainees successfully completed this long and rigorous course of study, they were granted the status of full citizens. Becoming a full citizen of Sparta was the greatest honor and an exceptional privilege, but this status also came with considerable responsibility. Firstly, even after graduating from school, an agoge graduate was not granted the right to live independently. It was assumed that he would continue to reside in military barracks for further honing his skills and maintaining combat readiness. This condition would not be so burdensome if not for one circumstance. Spartan men typically married between the ages of 18 and 20, and during their stay in the barracks, they were strictly forbidden from meeting their wives. Nevertheless, this rule was not always strictly observed, and men often secretly snuck home to see their wives. Such behavior is a direct consequence of the fact that cunning and trickery were key elements of Spartan education. However, this circumstance did not pose a significant difficulty, for Spartan citizens rarely lingered within Sparta itself. Their lives were entirely dedicated to military affairs. Having barely completed their initial training, they embarked on distant campaigns, waging continuous wars. During periods of calm between military campaigns, their attention shifted to maintaining strict control over the country's numerous slave population, to prevent the slightest signs of rebellion. Historical evidence indicates that at times, Spartiates unleashed almost full-scale internal conflicts against their subjugated people. Upon returning to their native city, they continued to reside in specialized military settlements, relentlessly honing their combat skills until they reached a mature age that granted them the right to special privileges and the beginning of independent life. Upon reaching the age of 30, Spartan citizens were granted the right to receive their own land plot, where they could finally settle down and lead a relatively independent life with their families. This land was supposed to be the basis of their prosperity. However, since Spartiates themselves were revered as the highest value of the state, they were strictly forbidden from engaging in any physical labor. In addition to the land plot, they were provided with several slaves, known in ancient Sparta as helots. This class occupied an intermediate position between slaves and serfs, representing the poorest stratum of Spartan society, whose duty was to perform all household tasks. Spartan citizens were also not allowed to engage in commercial activities, be it trade or other entrepreneurship. Due to these restrictions, they had to rely solely on interaction with free members of society, called perioika, who acted as intermediaries in selling the produce grown on their lands, of course, by the helots. Only such a scheme ensured them a decent and comfortable existence, and allowed them to acquire or manufacture the necessary military equipment and weaponry. In the ancient world, acquiring extensive landholdings and a large number of slaves traditionally served as a sure path to accumulating wealth. However, in Sparta, excessive wealth was not welcomed, as Spartans strived for discipline, minimalism, austerity, and a significant degree of asceticism. Every Spartan citizen was obliged to be a member of a syssitia, a kind of ancient communal dining hall, and presence at these joint meals was an unbreakable duty. For violating this establishment, even the king could be punished with a fine. The most famous culinary creation of the Spartans was the so-called black broth, a thick soup made from boiled pig's blood, pork, and vinegar. A modern person would likely find it extremely difficult to appreciate the taste of this dish. Membership in the syssitia was a necessary condition for maintaining strong social ties among Spartan citizens. In addition, everyone was required to eat in these dining halls at least once a day. Participation in such collective meals required certain contributions. These were not gold coins, but material donations, primarily in the form of food. Essentially, the concept was that since citizens ate there daily, they should proportionally participate in providing for these meals, a kind of principle of fair exchange. However, given the significant number of participants in these communal dining halls, the cost of membership proved to be quite high. If a citizen inefficiently managed their landholdings and, as a result, could not fully supply food to other members of the syssitia, it threatened them with serious difficulties, even leading to the loss of their citizenship. Naturally, the question arises, what did Spartans actually do if they were strictly forbidden from engaging in physical labor and any trade? It often gives the impression that Spartan citizens spent their days in idleness and carefree living, while the helots performed all the laborious work for them. However, such a statement is very far from the truth. Of course, Spartan citizens were freed from certain burdensome aspects of everyday human existence, but many other, no less significant obligations were imposed on them. First and foremost, they had to ensure sufficient profitability of their landholdings to cover the numerous expenses associated with their citizen status. And undoubtedly, military activity occupied a central place in their existence. It should be remembered that Spartan citizens were, first and foremost, professional warriors. A significant part of their lives was dedicated to learning military art in specialized schools, and another part to direct participation in battles. Thanks to their high level of training and discipline, casualties among Spartan warriors on the battlefields were relatively low. Consequently, this situation was not perceived as a significant problem for the polis. However, the situation began to undergo substantial changes starting from the 5th century BCE, as Sparta became involved in increasingly larger and longer military conflicts. A prime example is the period when the vast majority of Greek polis were subjected to aggression by the colossal Achaemenid Empire, also known as Persia, led by the powerful kings Darius and Xerxes, which possessed incomparably superior human and material resources. Although the Persian invaders were ultimately defeated, it is quite clear that without Sparta's decisive contribution, the other Greek polis would hardly have been able to withstand such a crushing onslaught. Thus, military service in the Spartan army was not just an obligation, but the true leitmotif, the dominant theme of every Spartan's entire life path. When in Sparta, the citizens of the polis were obliged to actively participate in state governance. All full citizens of this ancient community were members of popular assemblies, which, in essence, served as the supreme legislative body for both the city and the entire polis. These assemblies had the right to elect members of the Gerousia and the Ephors. The Gerousia was a respected council of elders, while the Ephors constituted a small college of 5 officials whose primary task was to strictly ensure compliance with all existing laws. In addition to the aforementioned bodies, Sparta had a unique system of diarchy, represented by 2 kings, traditionally called the first Spartans. Their role in the formation and execution of Spartan legislation was truly crucial. Spartan citizens who reached old age and were no longer able to perform military service remained in the city and held the honorable title of elders. A significant portion of these respected individuals held responsible political positions, serving, for example, as high-ranking officials. Notably, even those who chose a quieter existence enjoyed universal and profound respect, especially if in their youth they had displayed valor and achieved significant success on the battlefields. It is important to note that full citizens constituted only an extremely small percentage of the total population of Spartan society, yet they held all the wealth and all the power. It is thanks to their written testimonies and chronicles that all known stories and information about Sparta have reached us. From the peculiarities of their way of life, modern language has adopted words such as Spartan, meaning harsh and ascetic, and laconic, meaning short, concise, but at the same time extremely meaningful. However, there were many other layers of the population whose histories and fates, unfortunately, remain forever unknown to us. Nevertheless, it was precisely the strict, at times extreme, conditions of Spartan citizenship, along with their exceptional privileges, that allowed Sparta to stand out among other states of the ancient world and transform into a mighty military power.